We have a couple of student announcements. The first one is, the person's not here yet. You're here, she's here. So we have a student announcement. Real quick.
Hey guys, what's up? I just want to let you know that there's a college ball tournament going on March 6th through the 8th, which is Monday through Wednesday. And how many of you know which college bowl is? A few. Okay. College bowl is basically a team trivia challenge. It's kind of like Jeopardy with teams. You compete against other teams here on campus. What's really cool is the grand prize is $500 and the runner-up gets $250. Also, the 3-day tournament is from like 7:30 to 10. During those days, we'll feed you dinner and snacks, and you'll get a t-shirt, and it's just a really, really fun thing to do with your friends. So, not to mention we'll be raffling stuff off every night, like iPod shuffles and gift cards to Target, Oliver's, and stuff like that. So I have entry forms with me here today. All you need is a couple of friends. Teams are 3 to 4 people. And if you can just turn this in to me today, or the student union tomorrow is the due date. So is there anyone who might want an entry form? Yay! Okay, good. My name's Christine. I'm the coordinator. I'm really excited you guys sign up. Thank you.
Now we're going to appeal to your other side. And we have a representative of the Human Rights Club who's here to talk to you about the Human Rights Club. I know there are some of you who didn't get to sign up last week. She'll be passing the sheet around so that those of you who did not sign up can add your names. So let's hear from the Human Rights Club.
Okay, I'm Lauren Evans. I'm the president of the Human Rights Club. Myrna told me that some people were interested in the club, and so I came to ask if anybody's had any questions, and also to tell you guys that our first meeting is going to be March 1st at 7 p.m. in Charlie Brown's. So write it down if you want to come. We'd love to see everybody there. It's going to be an informational meeting, and of course, current members are invited as well. So should I pass the sheet around for anybody else who wants to join the... Yeah? Okay. Also, we're going to have our 2 weeks of Darfur Awareness Weeks in April from the 3rd to the 13th. So hopefully you guys want to get involved, and that's going to coincide with your jury power lecture too. So you guys will learn all about it.
The club's going to be gearing up for some activities for the time around the anniversary of genocide in Rwanda. So I think there are a lot of things that are planned. Hands up if you wanted. Okay. Over there. All right. Guess what? I get to introduce our speaker today. He's one of our own. Those of you who are history majors probably at least have seen him in the hallways. But he's currently on leave from the history department as a fellow of the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research. This is Professor Steve Bittner. I'm sure he prefers to be called Sir. No. Господин. Господин? Russian for Sir. Господин, Russian for Sir. He's got his BA from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He's just finished editing the memoirs of Dmitry Shekelov, who was a colleague of Stalin and Khrushchev, and it's going to be published by Yale University Press later this year. So let's all welcome our
Well, I will start, and hopefully we can round up the whiteboard.
I'll take care of that.
Oh, excellent. Do I have to use it? If I don't use the microphone, am I not recorded with the streaming, whatever? Okay, well, how many of you have had me before in a class? Wow, that's So I have a pretty big cohort here. So I knew there were a couple familiar faces.
No wonder you got applause.
Yeah, no wonder I got applause. That and the handsome bribes I paid. Well, as Myrna said, I am on leave this semester, so I fear I may be a little rusty on pedagogical skills. It's been 2 months now since I've been up in front of the crowd to speak. I've been spending a lot of my leave time finishing up one research project and getting going on another. And I often have the house to myself. My wife and my children are out during the day, which is very lonely to be at home all day. And so invariably I turn on the TV and I watch CNBC. You guys know what CNBC is? It's the financial news network. And it's not that I'm a great capitalist speculator or anything, but I like to watch that ticker tape go across the bottom of the screen. Because it convinces me that even though I'm always alone at home, that somewhere in this world there's something important going on. And that ticker tape is emblematic of those important things. But one thing I've noticed watching CNBC is now that when they have analysts come on to talk about a certain stock, an analyst is required to reveal whether he or she owns that stock. And I think this is a response to the scandals a couple of years ago in the business world. And it occurred to me that academics should do this as well. Before an academic gives a talk, an academic should disclose what his or her agenda is. So I will start with my own disclosures. First of all, no matter how you measure it, I am the least accomplished speaker of this semester. And arguably the last several years in this wonderful lecture series we have here at Sonoma State. The Holocaust lecture series reminds me a lot of the attractions of a big university. And Myrna said at the outset that I graduated from the University of Michigan. During my 4 years here at Sonoma State, I've really come to love many things about this place, but I miss the vitality of a bigger university. Well, let me tell you, this lecture series is an exception here at Sonoma State. This is exactly the sort of thing you would find at Berkeley or at UCLA. I'm very grateful for it. Honestly, the few times I've attended this as a spectator, where you are, I can almost close my eyes and imagine that I'm in Madison or Ann Arbor or some big university town. My second disclosure is that I am not a historian of Germany. I am a historian of the Soviet Union. So I'm an outsider to the field of Holocaust studies. And what this means is that I may deflect any questions you ask to Myrna or to Barbara or to the other faculty in attendance, or you guys have discussion sections as well, right? I may tell you to wait and ask your question in discussion section. Unlike some faculty, perhaps, I have no scruples about saying I don't know, and I will admit to you if I don't have an answer for you. But just because I'm an outsider, just because I do Soviet history, Russian history rather than German history, doesn't mean I haven't thought a great deal about the Holocaust. And in truth, there's a good deal of theoretical overlap in the scholarship on Stalinism and the scholarship on Nazism. Both systems, both isms, are joined by this concept that we call totalitarianism. And I see Carlos here. Carlos, what is totalitarianism? You wrote a really magnificent midterm exam challenging the very concept of totalitarianism.
Well, my paper looks, it's rather Foucault interpretation of it, that rather than looking at the state and oppression, you look at negotiating power. So you look at the Stalin regime and you look how in the 1920s you have the Nationalities Act and how they regulated with affirmative action programs their regime basically. So it's a new interpretation.
So if I were going to ask you to define totalitarianism, how would you do it? What does it mean? What does totalitarianism mean? Well, totalitarianism, like terrorism, is a word which is used so much that it has almost become devoid of meaning. But 50 years ago, two political scientists at Harvard coined this word, totalitarian, to describe political regimes like that in the Soviet Union and that in Nazi Germany that had totalizing ambitions. Okay, now that means that they're not only authoritarian, that means that they hope to control every aspect of the lives of its citizens, of their citizens. Okay, so what goes on at the kitchen table is subject to the purview of the state, just like what goes on in public. Now, it's a different question altogether whether Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia ever achieved this level of control. In short, the answer is probably no, but I think they certainly had these ambitions. Now, Stalinism and Nazism are also linked with the concept of genocide, which is your big subject for the semester. Although, in my mind, this is a less successful comparison. And despite all its flaws, I don't think the Soviet Union was ever genocidal. But many people do. Many serious scholars do. By the way, the comparison between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia is one, I think, where the Soviet Union comes off looking pretty well, pretty good. You compare the Soviet Union to France, and you don't have to move far beyond food until you realize that France excels way beyond the Soviet Union in most measures. But that's not true of Nazi Germany. Now, it is also true that the Holocaust was primarily an Eastern European and a Soviet event. And this is important because our image of the Holocaust here in the United States tends to be one of Anne Frank holed up in the attic of her apartment building in Amsterdam and of Vichy collaborators in France. You guys know what Vichy is? What is this word? Vichy. Yeah.
I was going to say that the French puppet government that took control of that country after the German invasion in World War II.
That's exactly right. The collaborationist government is Jacob, right?
Yep.
Excellent. I remember your name. But the truth is that the vast majority of persons who perished during the Holocaust resided in the eastern parts of Europe. Okay? If we include lands partitioned by the Soviet Union in 1939, as some of you might know, in 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union essentially divided Poland between the two of them. If we include these Polish territories as part of the Soviet Union, then roughly half of the victims of the Holocaust were Soviet citizens. So 3 million Soviet Jews perished in the Holocaust. And really the heartland of European Jewry, what was called the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale of Settlement were the territories that Jews were confined to, according to the laws of Tsarist Russia. The Pale of Settlement exists in what is presently Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. This historic heartland of the European Jewry was left almost entirely devoid of Jews at the end of the war. In fact, a very famous Soviet writer named Ilya Ehrenberg got in trouble for writing a book in the late 1940s called Ukraine без евреев, Ukraine without Jews. Stalin did not think that was a good topic for a book. So even though I'm an outsider to this field, I have thought a great deal about it as a Soviet historian. Now, if I were to ask each one of you what the Holocaust was, I am confident that nearly all of you could answer. You would say something to the effect that the Holocaust was the event where German soldiers, German political leaders, German bureaucrats, and their non-German abettors planned and executed the systematic murder of roughly 6 million Jews and smaller numbers of Roma. You guys know what the Roma are? Gypsies, that's right. Slavs, handicapped persons, homosexuals, and communists. As such, the Holocaust is the central event in all of German history. It is the central event in all of modern European history. It colors our understanding of what it means to be German and what it means to be European. And it forces us to rethink events as pivotal and events as distant as the Enlightenment. So what was the Enlightenment? Who's heard of the Enlightenment before in this class? Okay, so what was it? About half of you raised your hands. In what context do you learn about the Enlightenment here at Sonoma State?
How I learned about it mostly was that it was these sort of humanist ideas where, but I know it was this huge philosophical change in the way people thought. It was really important.
It was really important. When did the Enlightenment occur? Well, you know, like many important events, the Enlightenment does not have a clear start date, right? I mean, dawn on a given morning, nobody woke up and said, the Enlightenment has begun. But generally speaking, historians tend to identify the period 1650 to 1800 as the Enlightenment. And this period is important because philosophers, and enlightened political leaders like Catherine the Great in Russia and Frederick the Great in Prussia tried to apply scientific law to the realm of human behavior, and especially to the realm of politics. Now, the Enlightenment gave us the American Revolution. Our own political system is very much a product of the Enlightenment. It gave us the French Revolution. More important, the Enlightenment gave us the idea that I bet the vast majority of you in this room subscribe to, that human existence can be improved upon, and our lives are somehow better than the lives of our predecessors. Okay? How many people agree with that? I mean, be honest. We don't all have to be cynics to be students here at Sonoma State. I mean, I think I subscribe to this view, too, this sort of positivist view of history, right? We're somehow improving ourselves. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in conclusion, about the way the Holocaust has affected our understanding of the Enlightenment. So each of you could answer what the Holocaust was. But if I asked you why the Holocaust happened, I suspect you would find it much more difficult to answer. I mean, why did hundreds of thousands of seemingly normal, seemingly intelligent, and otherwise moral German citizens participate in mass murder? Why did millions of their countrymen do nothing to stop it? And as the historian Daniel Jonah Goldhagen pointed out a few years ago, your answers would probably have as much to do with the nature of human existence as they would with the individual motivations of persons who participated in homicide. A few of you may even refer to what Joseph Conrad called the heart of darkness. That is the innate capacity, or the seemingly innate capacity of human beings to commit evil acts. Now, I am not so naive to think that I can answer this question today in the remaining hour and 20 minutes I have here. In fact, I'm pretty confident that if this lecture series still exists in 100 years at Sonoma State, yes, that we will still be debating this question. Why did the Holocaust occur? But what I'd like to do today is to try to give you the historical background and the conceptual tools to begin to formulate an answer on your own. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple things here today. I'm going to identify three structural developments that, in my mind, set the stage, so to speak, for the Holocaust, or facilitated the Holocaust. And then I'll move on to the specific circumstances in which the Nazis came to power and how they went about persecuting the Jews. And then I'll conclude, if I have time, with really what I think is the most interesting thing, how have historians made sense of the Holocaust? And I'll offer you some of the broad conceptual frameworks that historians have applied to this event. Okay. My first structural factor that facilitated the Holocaust in my mind is anti-Semitism. Now, a couple years ago in this very lecture series, we had the foremost of all Holocaust historians, a man named Yehuda Bauer, come visit us. And actually, as unversed as I am in Holocaust studies, Bauer's book is one of the few I've read. And I distinctly remember that Bauer takes on this term. He points out how stupid the term actually is, anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism supposes that there's a Semitism to be opposed to, when in fact there is no doctrine of Semitism, right? I mean, what does Semitism mean? It means nothing. Nonetheless, in its common usage, anti-Semitism refers to animosity towards Jews, but not towards other Semitic peoples. What are the other Semitic peoples? Arabs. So if we take a wide definition of anti-Semitism, I think we could say that there's been a great deal of anti-Semitism in the United States since 9/11. But nonetheless, in popular usage, anti-Semitism means animosity, refers to animosity towards Jews. Now, in some forms, anti-Semitism is as old as Christianity itself. Many verses in the New Testament strike the modern reader as anti-Semitic. And this, of course, was an issue a couple years ago when Mel Gibson made this film, The Passion of Christ. My colleague Bill Poe, who teaches biblical history, told me earlier today that these verses probably reflect tensions in the early Christian church between Jews who converted to the new language, or to the new religion, and Jews who did not convert to the new religion. Now, much of religious anti-Semitism or Christian anti-Semitism hinges on the idea that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. Okay? For instance, according to the book of John, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem, was ready to pardon Christ, but was convinced otherwise by a hostile Jewish crowd. According to the book of Matthew, Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest, yes, many of you don't know how to spell Caiaphas, so I spell it. Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, helped fabricate evidence against Christ. And this was actually the specific issue that came to a head in Mel Gibson's film. Although, I was just looking over this stuff yesterday, and actually a fuller reading of the book of Matthew suggests that Caiaphas actually wanted to stave off a Roman military intervention in Israel by sacrificing Christ to the Romans. But nonetheless, as a result of this idea that Jews were somehow responsible for the death of Christ, it was accepted doctrine within the Catholic Church well into the 20th century that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. And this alone was often the cause of popular animosity towards Jews. For instance, when the plague hit Europe in the middle of the 14th century, there were widespread rumors that the plague was caused by Jews who had poisoned the water. Of course, we know now, beyond the shadow of a doubt, what actually caused the plague. What was the cause of the plague? What's that?
Fleas on the rats.
That's right. The plague was transmitted by the fleas that lived off the rats. We don't know how these rats got to Europe. It may have been with the Mongols. Russia in the 13th century. There were also persistent rumors, even in the early part of the 20th century, I've seen this in my own research on Russia, that Jews used the blood of Christian children in their Passover matzahs. Along with Muslims, Jews were targets of the Crusades in the 11th through the 13th centuries. You guys know what the Crusades are? The attempt to take back the Holy Lands in the Middle East. Jews were objects of the Inquisition. What was the Inquisition? Actually, the Inquisition still exists. It does exist under a different name. In fact, the former Archbishop of San Francisco is now head of the Inquisition. The Inquisition is that institution in the Roman Catholic Church that patrols for heresy. So Jews were often subject to the Inquisition. In the 12th and the 13th centuries, Jews were repeatedly expelled from France. They were expelled from Spain in 1492, the date we associate with Columbus. Jews were expelled from Prussia, that is Prussia with a P. What is Prussia?
Germany, kind of.
Yeah, the predecessor, one of the predecessors to Germany, the East German principalities. Jews were expelled from Prussia in the 1700s. In the Russian Empire, where many of these displaced Jews moved, they were confined to the Pale of Settlement. These lands in Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. In large parts of Eastern Europe, Jews were forbidden from owning land. And this gives us the stereotype of the Jewish merchant, or the Jewish money changer. I mean, if you can't make your living by farming the land, like the vast majority of your counterparts do, your options are limited to something entrepreneurial. Unexpected or unexplainable tragedies frequently resulted in what in Russia is called pogrom. This is a word that had translated into English. Pogrom. What is a pogrom? Yeah.
Like a program of persecution of Jews, like organized, basically.
That's exactly right. You all learned the Russian word. Grom is a prefix in Russian. It means little. Grom is the Russian word for storm. So pogrom is a little storm. It's a popular uprising against Jews. And these were not uncommon in the Russian Empire. So anti-Semitism has been with us for a very long time. But that does not mean that anti-Semitism is unchanging. In fact, over the course of the 19th century, anti-Semitism changed in a very important way. Anti-Semitism became less religious and more racial in orientation. Okay? And this reflected two important developments. The first is that Jews, the objects of anti-Semitism, their lives they were increasingly assimilated into their home societies. Many Jews were moving to the cities. Jewish lives were increasingly urban. Many Jews no longer practiced. They were no longer religious. Men did not wear beards. They did not wear yarmulkes. In the Russian Empire, even though the laws regulating movement in and out of the Pale of Settlement were not technically repealed until 1917, movement in and out of the Pale was tolerated. And so there are large Jewish communities in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. Now, that's the first factor that is responsible for this switch to racial anti-Semitism. The second factor were, I guess, what you could call pseudo-scientific theories that were in vogue in the 19th century. And these pseudo-scientific theories attributed certain physical and mental characteristics to ethnic groups. And we've all heard what these characteristics are, right? Englishmen and Americans are individualistic. Germans are punctual. Irishmen love to drink. But Jews were associated with less savory characteristics. According to these pseudo-scientific theories, Jews were greedy. They were rootless. What does that mean to be rootless? Yeah, they have no home. I have to admit, as an academic, I often felt rootless. And most importantly, Jews were cosmopolitan. Okay, and this word in the 19th century means the same thing it does today, but the values are reversed. Okay, so what does it mean to be cosmopolitan? If I say you're very cosmopolitan, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah, what does that mean to be cosmopolitan?
You can adapt or something, like in cities stuff. That's in cities for sure.
Well, I mean, I think what's that? Hip, yeah. I think at its core, it means that you're worldly in outlook, right? I mean, your intellectual horizons are broad. But what this meant in the context of Jews in the 19th century, and as late as the late 1940s and the early 1950s in the Soviet Union, is that Jews had no loyalty to the state. Instead, Jews were loyal to various transnational groups like the Jewish diaspora or Zionism, which I'll talk about in a little bit, or communism. Okay? So Jews were not patriotic. Rather, their allegiances were to these transnational phenomena. Now you may have noticed that there's actually a contradiction here. On one hand, Jews are greedy. On the other hand, Jews seem to have a special penchant for being communists. How can this be? I mean, how can you be a greedy communist? That seems to be mutually exclusive. And this is what my favorite thinker about the Holocaust, he's a sociologist, named Zygmunt Bauman, calls the viscosity of Jewish identity. Okay, what does this word mean, viscosity? We have any car gurus here? What does viscosity measure when you use it in conjunction with a motor oil?
Isn't it how thick it is?
And why is that important? Well, it's a measure of slipperiness, right? And so Bauman is pointing out that Jewish identity is very slippery, especially to anti-Semites. Jews could be arch-capitalists, on one hand, greedy in the extreme, or they could be conniving, atheistic Bolsheviks. Okay, and what's amazing is you'll have the same anti-Semite one minute saying, they're arch-capitalists, and the next minute saying they're atheistic Bolsheviks, and apparently unaware of the contradiction. Now, this is hardly an exhaustive list of the indignities that Jews were subjected to over the last 2,000 years, and nor is it meant to be. But I do want to underscore a point that the historian Jan Gross makes in his recent book about the Holocaust in the Polish village of Goodman. And I just assigned this book for the first time last semester. Was anybody in that class with me? No, a really wonderful book, very short, succinct. Gross points out that before the Holocaust, anti-Semitism from the perspective of Jews was a lot like an intractable, low-intensity war. Okay, particularly in the East, Jews had to be savvy to survive. So a moment's carelessness could lead to an insult that would produce a pogrom. Gazing too long at the mayor's daughter could produce a pogrom. But the point is, at least according to Gross, is that this low-intensity war was survivable. In all but a few extraordinary instances, the Holocaust was not. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, my second structural factor that I think set the stage for the Holocaust was the advent of nationalism. Now, what is nationalism? Yeah.
Nationalism is a collective group of ideas that bring people together. They can be based upon, or a lot of the time it's based upon common mythology, political views, places where ideologies
an ISM, right? So, and you know that's the suffix that means it's a doctrine. And frequently, if any of you guys do the New York Times crossword puzzle, this is one of the most common clues. Doctrine, 3 letters. It's always ISM. Nationalism is the doctrine that holds, and here I'll give you a 1-sentence definition. Nationalism is the doctrine that holds that each nation should have its own state. Okay, so what is a nation? Yeah. Well, you mean can a nation be united by politics rather than culture? Well,
I mean, like, a state defined by a political boundary. Nationalism, I would say, would be more of a common language, common religion, etc.
any other ideas on what a nation is? Well, a nation is nothing more than a group of people where each individual feels that he or she has something in common with the other members of the group. And what that is varies. You know, what binds a nation together varies. It can be culture, it can be ethnicity, it can be language, it can be religion, it can be some combination of the above. Actually, the American nation is very peculiar in this regard. What is it that binds Americans together?
Idea.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in theory, right, we're a creedal people. You can become an American by subscribing to this creed, these core ideas that underlie the American Republic. But, you know, different nations define themselves very differently. In Russia, until 1917, one became Russian by converting to Orthodoxy. In Germany, it was always very ethnic-centric. In France, which perhaps is the European country with the model of national identity most similar to our own, you know, France is also very much part of subscribing to the French ideal of speaking the French language. Now, despite what nationalists say, nations are relatively recent phenomena in human history. You know, it's interesting, nationalists always tend to posit the roots of the nation in the distant past. But actually, nations, even the oldest nations, have only existed for roughly 200 years. Many of the nations in Eastern Europe are considerably younger than this. Some have existed for less than 100 years. Now, what does this mean? A nation is only 200 years old. What this means is that the persons who reside in this nation are part of this nation. They only understood that this identity was important in the last 200 years. If you asked a Russian 500 years ago, who are you? You know, this poor peasant wouldn't have identified himself as a Russian. He would have said, I'm a resident of this village in Tambov, or, you know, I'm Orthodox. I farm the land. I'm a subject of the Tsar. But he never would have said Russian. That's a new identity. Now, in Western Europe, the signal event for nationalists was the French Revolution in 1789. And the French Revolution is important because it located political sovereignty in the broad citizenry rather than in a narrow aristocracy or an even narrower royal family. That is, the state legitimized itself by appealing to its citizens rather than to the aristocracy or to the royal family, the king. In Central and Eastern Europe, the situation was a little different. Here, territories were incorporated into these great multinational empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And here, nationalism was shaped in important ways by a cultural phenomenon called Romanticism. What is Romanticism? Somebody calls you a romantic, is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, I actually have an aunt that writes romance romance novels. I see her frequently when I'm checking out at the grocery store. That's much more lucrative than being a history professor. But unfortunately, that's not what romantic means in the context of the 19th century. In its broadest sense, Romanticism as a cultural movement refers to a cultural movement in which feeling and imagination are emphasized rather than science and rationality. Okay? Now, this is important because by the 1750s in Europe, the notion of historical progress, the notion that the present is somehow better than the past, was really firmly entrenched. And the French and American revolutions seemed to be proof of this, proof that the future would be better than the present and the present was better than the past. Because the French and American revolutions seemed to promise the emancipation of all men. Right? And I guess the gender is important here too, right? Men. And so they seem to mark the political culmination of this progressivist view of history. Now, Romanticism was a reaction to this growing confidence. Romanticism expressed deep anxiety about where human beings were going and about the extent and pace of social and cultural change. Romanticism was skeptical of science. Romanticism was skeptical of the claims that man had mastered the secrets of the universe, or that man could even really describe what was going on around him. Now, in Germany, Romantic nationalists, and there's a couple, the most important is a guy named Johann von Herwitz. But another one is one that perhaps some of you will have heard of, the 19th century composer Richard Wagner. Romantic nationalists like Herder and Wagner celebrated folk culture as the only constant in this sea of change. Right? I mean, imagine the extent of social and cultural change in Europe at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. You have the Industrial Revolution, you have the French Revolution, the last remnants of feudalism had disappeared with Napoleon's march across the continent. Now, in folk culture, Herder and Wagner located the kernel of the authentic national soul. Okay? So the nation was unified because it shared in the cultural patrimony of this authentic national soul. And the best place to find this authentic national soul was, in peasants out in the countryside that haven't been contaminated by modern urban culture. Now, contrary to French national identity, which was creedal and assimilationist, German national identity, as it was envisioned by the Romantics, was ethnic and exclusionary. In other words, you were born into the German nation. And if you were not born into the German nation, there was nothing you could do to get into it. And actually, this has been the case until quite recently. It's only been in the last 15 years that a person of non-German ethnicity could become a citizen of Germany. They could reside there, but they couldn't become a citizen. Now, the irony here, of course, is that Romantic nationalists were often worldly, multilingual intellectuals who idealized the lives of illiterate peasants. But as a political doctrine, nationalism was and remains one of the most successful and one of the most powerful of all time. And it's the one big thing that Karl Marx just got wrong. And if you take my Soviet history courses, we talk about this. Karl Marx simply underestimated the power of nationalism as a motivating force. Think about it. In Europe, over the course of 100 years, from say roughly 1850 to 1950, Europe ceased to be a continent of empires and became a continent of nation states. Okay, that is, states that base their legitimacy on the national community. So let me read you a list of what these are, And I can't imagine you will be held responsible for these. At least I hope not, but maybe so. Serbia became a nation state in 1815. Now actually Serbia was only a nation state for 103 years because in 1918 it was incorporated into the Kingdom of South Slavs, which was the predecessor to modern-day Yugoslavia. Greece became a nation state in 1829. Romania in 1859. Italy in 1861. Germany in 1871. As the modern German state was created in 1871. Bulgaria in 1878. Albania in 1912. And then, with the end of World War I in 1918, we have all the new states that were created at the end of the war. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Hungary, and Ukraine. Now, of course, Ukraine's experiment with independence was rather short. By the end of 1919, Ukraine was under Soviet control. And then finally, Turkey. 1923, the Turkish Republic was created. So this is an incredibly powerful political doctrine. But it also caused problems. The borders between nation states were rarely perfect. Okay? So you have Romanians living inside Russia. You have Ukrainians in Poland. You have Germans in Czechoslovakia. You have Turks in Bulgaria. Millions of Europeans, by the end of World War I, lived outside of their titular nation state. And if you look at the handout that I have passed out, you will see that there are figures on two. Has everybody gotten this? They're circulating around here. I have given you a list of Jewish populations within the European nation states, and then German populations. Now, Jews are an interesting case here. Jews, at the end of World War I, had a national ideology, Zionism. This is ideology that foresaw the creation of a Jewish state. But they still had no nation state. In fact, Jews would not have a nation state until after World War II, when the modern state of Israel was created. Okay, any questions about nationalism? By the way, one other thing that these charts are emblematic of, if you look at Jewish identity is gauged in two different ways, by religion and by ethnicity. And you see that in those states that took both, the ethnic figure is always larger than the religious figure. And what this is emblematic of is Jewish assimilation. Presumably the difference it comprises Jews that no longer practice. Right? And I have to pay tribute here to my predecessor at Sonoma State, Steve Watrous, who compiled all these statistics. And in very small print at the bottom of each of those PowerPoint slides, it indicates that. Okay, the third structural element that I think set the stage for the Holocaust is militarism. Okay? In 1870 is an important year in European history because this is the year in which every major European power, for the first time, maintains a standing army. What does that mean, a standing army? Yeah.
They always have a certain amount of people reserved.
That's right. Even in peacetime, we maintain an army. This is a rather novel development. This was always just seen as too costly. But after 1870, every major European power maintains a standing army and spends increasing amounts of money on weapons production and on the military. Between 1875 and 1914, military spending doubled in France. It tripled in Great Britain and in Germany. And by 1914, in the Russian Empire, the military accounted for 1/3 of the total state budget. On the eve of World War I, there were 19 million men in uniform on the European continent. And military thinking and military values pervaded European societies. There were also important technological advances. The French introduced the machine gun in the 1860s. New industrial processes made possible the development of new types of artillery. By 1914, the Germans had artillery that could launch a shell 75 miles. Iron bottoms revolutionized naval warfare. Sort of ships that were built out of steel rather than wood. And even more ominously, European nations began to experiment with chemical arms. And as some of you may know, World War I saw wide use of chemical weapons. But even more important than spending on the military and on weapons development was the fact that the very idea of violence became culturally acceptable in Europe by the end of the 19th century. Marxists, social Darwinists, liberals, racists, they all thought that struggle between peoples was historically necessary and unavoidable. Jingoism became the accepted form of patriotic expression. What is jingoism? If somebody says you're jingoistic, is that good or bad? Yeah, Carlos?
It's sort of related to like ethnic centrism. It's like an extreme form of nationalism where you are the top, the best in every other nation or culture.
Yeah, that's a lot of it. Carlos?
I was going to say exaggerated form of patriotism.
A very bellicose form of patriotism, right? If we get matched up with the Canadians in the hockey, Olympic hockey, I don't know, I might be a little jingoistic. This comes from a youth spent playing hockey against the Canadian teams across the river in Michigan. So this enthusiasm for violence, during World War I, this enthusiasm for violence was manifested in desertion rates that were far lower than what anyone expected. For instance, the French went into World War I expecting desertion rates as high as 10%. In reality, less than 2% of French soldiers deserted from the trenches. And let me tell you, if there ever was a senseless war, World War I was it. And there was more than enough reason to desert to the rear. Okay, so those are my structural factors that set the stage for the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism, nationalism, and militarism. Any questions on all that? Yeah? Militarism. What's that? Isms, yeah, my 3 isms. Okay, well, I will move on now to the Nazi rise of power, and I have 45 minutes left, so I may abbreviate some of this. As many of you probably know, Nazi success built upon the failures of German liberalism. And by the way, this word liberal means something very different in the context of 19th and early 20th century Europe than what it means now. Liberalism simply means, it refers to political parties that respect the free market. And Nazism was a response really to the failures of German liberalism. In particular, the failures of what was called the Weimar Republic. And Weimar is a city in Germany. It's a city where the Constitution was drafted after the German capitulation in World War I at the end of 1918. And the Weimar Republic lasted until 1933. And during this period, it was arguably the world's most democratic state. Weimar had many, many weaknesses. Historians, there were many historical careers have been made by studying the weaknesses of Weimar. Actually, very few have been made by studying the strengths of Weimar. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the onerous reparations of the Treaty of Versailles that were placed on the Weimar Republic. The German economy was simply unable to pay these sums to its former adversaries. I think equally important was political polarization between the extreme left and the extreme right in Weimar. For instance, on November 9, 1918, the day that the German monarchy was destroyed and the German Republic was proclaimed, Karl Liebknecht, who was a German socialist, Karl Liebknecht, who was a German socialist, proclaimed the foundation of a socialist republic. It would be as if on that day, July 4th, 1776, when the Americans declared their independence, if somebody else had been there in Philadelphia and declared the creation of an entirely different state. Well, that's what happened in Weimar on November 9, 1918. Two states were created on the same day, and it was emblematic of this degree of political polarization. There were right-wing uprisings in Weimar in 1920 and in 1923 that capitalized on popular disenchantment over the economy. And things only got worse through the course of the 1920s. As those of you who are better versed in American history than I am know, the American economy tanked in 1929 when the economy slipped into recession. In October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. Europe collapsed within weeks following the American crash. American financiers were no longer able to extend loans to European economies. By 1932, American investment in Europe had fallen by 70% when compared to the 1929 figure. And this was particularly rough for Germany, because Germany was dependent upon American loans in order to pay the Versailles reparations. Now, I guess it's not surprising, therefore, that Germany was really the first state to experience political upheaval. And in parliamentary elections in September of 1930, German voters stunned all the pundits, all the onlookers, by handing 107 seats out of 611, to the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party. And overnight, the Nazis went from being a fringe party that was the object of many jokes to comprising the second largest bloc within the German parliament, within the German Reichstag. So the Nazis were really the prime beneficiaries of the mounting economic crisis. Now, of course, we all know that the Nazis were led by Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. As a young man, he dabbled as a painter, but he was denied admission to the Academy of Fine Art in Vienna. And this is an interesting exercise in counterfactual history. What would have happened if? What if the admissions committee had only looked differently on Hitler's skills as an artist? International nor socialist. Talk amongst yourselves. Socialist here, and socialist and Nazi was meant to express the feeling of solidarity that supposedly existed among German veterans of World War I. In 1923, Hitler was arrested for participating in a coup against the Bavarian government in the city of Munich. Fortunately, the coup plotters were caught before any damage could be done, and Hitler was sentenced to 9 months in prison. And it was while Hitler was in prison that he wrote the book that would become the Bible of the Nazi movement. Mein Kampf, My Struggle. In Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out his view of history. Rather than seeing history as, say, a product of class struggle, like Karl Marx, Hitler claimed that history was driven by struggle between the races. Okay, so that was the engine of history, according to Marx. That's what moves history along. Now, according to Hitler, the master race were the Aryans, Northern Europeans, the predecessors of the Germans and the Brits, and they were ordained by God to be the implacable foes of lesser races, especially the Jews, but also the Slavs, Slavic peoples. Now, according to Hitler, Germany had to adopt an aggressive foreign policy in order to meet its historical destiny, its destiny that God had ordained. And he thought that the German army had to conquer essential living space in the East so the German nation could thrive. And Hitler knew that this expansion would anger France. But he calculated that Britain, wrongly as it turned out, he calculated that Britain would never intervene to stop German expansion in the East, because after all, the Brits and the Germans were the heirs of this, this Aryan race. So these were the core elements of Nazi policy: racial superiority on one hand, and the need for territorial expansion on the other. Now, Hitler came to power in Germany almost by accident. Despite the impressive showing of the Nazis in 1930, they were still only the second largest party. The largest party were the Social Democrats, a moderate left-of-center party. By 1932, the Nazis had become the strongest party in numeric terms in the Reichstag, but they still had nowhere near a majority. I think in 1932, they controlled 230 of the 611 seats in the Reichstag. And there's some evidence that suggests that by the end of 1932 and the beginning of 1933, that Nazi electoral support was actually fading. And the Nazis were losing support to the communists. And I think this is proof that, that you go far enough right, you actually start coming back left. It's not a spectrum, it's a circle, political circle. So the Nazi phenomenon, I guess if you were looking at the situation at the beginning of 1933, many wise political pundits thought that the Nazi phenomenon was beginning to fade. But ironically, the Nazi seizure of power can be attributed, at least in part, to the commitment among German liberals and German social democrats to the core tenets of liberal democracy. Okay? At the end of 1932, the German chancellor tried to convince the German president, a guy named Hindenburg, to outlaw the Nazi Party. And Hindenburg refused because he saw this as a violation of core democratic liberties: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. You can't just outlaw a party. But nonetheless, he clearly recognized that something had to be done to constrain the Nazis. And the situation seemed absolutely ingenious at the time, but in retrospect, it was clearly one of the great screw-ups of all time. Hindenburg offered Hitler the chancellorship in January 1933. Okay? As chancellor, Hitler would rule over a coalition cabinet, an 11-person cabinet, in which 3 of the 11 were members of the Nazi Party. And the rationale behind this was, once Hitler was actually in a position where he was governing, he would be forced to moderate his behavior. Okay? Now, interestingly, much the same has been said about Hamas the last several weeks after they came to power in the West Bank. We'll see if that turns out a little better. But But once Hitler was actually in power, he moved quickly to consolidate control. He demanded that elections be held to the Reichstag, the German parliament, in March of 1933. But at the end of February, the German parliament building burned down. And we know now that the fire was probably set by a Nazi arsonist, but nonetheless, the communists were blamed for it. And in fact, a very prominent and important communist named Georgy Dimitrov, who later becomes an important figure in the Soviet government, was blamed for it. And the result was a sort of popular pogrom in Berlin against the communists. The next day, like 4,000 communists have been rounded up and arrested in Berlin. And in the ensuing days, Nazi thugs terrorized their political opponents in the streets of Berlin and other big German cities. And this really set the stage for the Nazi electoral triumph on March 5th. On this day, the Nazis won 44% of the vote to the Reichstag. But with their allies in another right-wing party, the Nationalist Party, the Nazis could claim a majority and essentially rule as they saw fit. But actually, the Reichstag didn't rule as it saw fit. One of the Reichstag's first acts was the so-called Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler to rule by decree for a period of 4 years. So essentially, what the Reichstag did was decree itself into non-existence. It passed all political power on to Hitler. So Hitler became a dictator, even though he never achieved a majority electoral support from the German citizens. Now, two factors made Nazi expansion so rapid. The first was the Nazis had no scruples about relying on coercion, either through the Gestapo, the secret police, or later the SS, the successor to the Gestapo. And secondly, thousands and thousands and thousands of German bureaucrats joined the Nazi Party in order to advance their careers. So they saw in it upward mobility. Now, there were a couple institutions that might have given Hitler trouble. One of these institutions was the army. German generals, we know that German generals had little respect for Hitler. They thought he was a madman. But Hitler needed the support of the army in order to embark on this aggressive territorial expansion. So, on June 30th, 1934, he accused German generals of homosexuality, and he sent the SS to assassinate them. And this becomes known as the Night of Long Knives. So June 30, 1934. We have an eraser.
I don't think so. I think
That is it.
that's the eraser.
Somebody gave up their shirt, so I can have an eraser. I once had a professor in college who couldn't find an eraser, and he took his shirt like this. He was a real metrosexual. That essentially spelled the end of opposition from the army. Effective opposition might also have come from Christian churches within Germany. And if you break down who voted for whom, it's clear that the Nazi electoral triumph in 1933 was made possible by support from Protestant middle-class voters. Okay? But nonetheless, most Protestant clergymen tried to remain politically neutral. And a very small minority of Protestant clergymen actually organized an active resistance. And many of these Protestant clergymen have retrospectively been proclaimed heroes of the German nation. And something like 800 Protestant clergymen died in the concentration camps for resisting the Nazis. The role of the Catholic Church is more cloudy and more controversial. In 1933, Hitler signed a treaty with the Vatican in which Pope Pius XI gave his stamp of approval to the Nazi regime in return for Hitler's pledge that he would respect the traditional liberties that Catholics had enjoyed as a minority religion within Germany. Okay? Now, what did this mean in effect? What it meant is that it undermined the ability of the Catholic Center Party, a party of Catholic politicians, to oppose Hitler's government. And in truth, Hitler's assurances to the papacy proved to be mostly worthless. Through the mid and late 1930s, the Nazis ruthlessly attacked Catholic youth groups and Catholic schools. And we know the Pope Pius realized in 1937 that his treaty with Hitler was a mistake, and he issued an encyclical. You know what an encyclical is? A papal proclamation, which was called With Burning Sorrow. And in this encyclical, Pope Pius denounced all forms of totalitarianism. Soviet totalitarianism, Nazi totalitarianism. But he did not denounce anti-Semitism. And of course, this encyclical also came when it was really too late to do anything about the Nazis. By 1937, the Nazis were firmly entrenched. Now, Nazi racism was directed primarily against Jews. We know that. In 1933, after coming to power, Hitler expelled most Jews from positions in the German government. 2 years later, in 1935, he issued what were called the Nuremberg Laws. This is probably one of these things you're going to be held responsible for at some point, the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws denied German citizenship to persons with 2 or more Jewish grandparents. So essentially it was a definition of what constitutes Jewishness. 2 or more Jewish grandparents. It prohibited marriage and sexual intercourse between Germans and Jews. And it required Jews to wear the yellow Star of David when they were in public. It allowed German towns to refuse residency to Jews. And it forced German businesses to fire their Jewish employees. Now, by 1938, roughly 100,000 German Jews had fled abroad. Many fled to the United States. Many were less fortunate in where they fled, and they fled to other parts of Europe where they were later picked up. But those who remained at home were subjected to seemingly never-ending persecution. On November 8th of 1938, Nazi terrorists subjected those Jews who remained to what was called Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And I actually, here's Hitler joining the government. This is the moment where he is brought into the cabinet. See Hitler down there on the bottom right. And here I have some photos of Kristallnacht. Synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses were burned, Jews were pulled out into the streets and beaten. I think I have some figures here. 200 synagogues were burned. A picture of some of them. 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Strangely, Hitler, after Kristallnacht was over, Hitler blamed Jews for the disturbances, and 25,000 Jews were incarcerated, reportedly because they were too rowdy on Kristallnacht. And these early attacks on Jews were part of what we can call the disemancipation phase of Nazi policy. What does that word mean, disemancipation? Yeah, Liz?
Enslavement of Jewish population. They had been emancipated, they would have been free, but disemancipation counter.
Yeah, right. It's the opposite of emancipation. It's the process whereby rights that Jews had formerly enjoyed are being taken away from them. And what made the Nazi program so unique was not so much the disemancipation phase of their persecution. There was ample precedent for this in Europe. What made this situation so unique is that they moved from disemancipation to methodical genocide in the late 1930s and 1940s. And genocide was linked with the issue of the war. As many of you know, World War II begins on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. According to the articles of this secret Hitler-Stalin treaty, Molotov-Ribbentrop treaty, and then 2 weeks later, the Soviets moved in and occupied their zone of Poland. And Hitler, of course, he wanted this territory for living space, for Lebensraum in the east. And according to the head of the SS, a guy named Himmler, according to Himmler, approximately 30 million people would have to either be exterminated or shifted farther east in order to free up living space for Germans. And to this end, Himmler authorized special SS action teams to go through newly occupied territories in Poland and slaughter at will. And these action teams were called the Einsatzgruppen. And these units typically forced their victims, many of whom were Jews, many were communists, to dig mass graves and then line up on the edge of the graves in order to be shot. Millions of Soviet citizens perished in this way. Some 3.7 million Soviet prisoners of war died in this manner. Now, of course, Hitler didn't have much affinity for the Slavs, but even lower on his racial hierarchy were the Jews. And Hitler was determined to eradicate as many of the 11 million Jews who lived in Europe as possible. Soon after the outbreak of World War II, Jews in Poland were herded into ghettos. The first ghetto was in the Polish city of Lodz, but then there was the largest was created in the Polish city of Warsaw. And it was from the ghettos that Jews were sent to extermination camps like Auschwitz. The ghettos were not meant to be exterminatory. Is that a word, exterminatory? But oftentimes the living conditions were so bad there that the death rates were well above 15-20% every year. And so they had that effect. And I have a picture here taken from the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, at first, the ghettos were only a temporary measure to separate Jews from the rest of the population. But in July of 1941, the order was given, which we now identify as the beginning of methodical mass murder. And the order was written by Gordon. And in the order, the phrasing was, quote, a total solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. And the following January, and this would be in January of 1942, Nazi leaders met in a suburb of Berlin. The suburb is called Wannsee. To plan the systematic eradication of Jews and how they would go about doing this. And they recognized, Nazi leaders recognized at Wannsee that execution by machine guns, that is essentially the means of execution that the Einsatzgruppen employed, was simply too inefficient to kill the numbers of persons that the Nazis hoped to kill. And so the preferred method was the gas chamber. And the gas chamber had several advantages. After execution, dental fillings could be removed, the bodies could be burned, and then the ashes were used for fertilizer. Some corpses were actually boiled to produce soap. The most notorious of these camps was Auschwitz in Poland. Picture of it. Auschwitz was a model of German efficiency. You see there, I'm attributing to Germans a core characteristic, right? They're efficient. Auschwitz was a model of German efficiency. It regularly killed 12,000 people a day. By the end of the war, it was responsible for the deaths of 2.5 million Jews in the gas chambers, and then roughly another 500,000 by barbaric treatment. People died of hunger or being worked to death. The Nazis exterminated other peoples as well: gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, the mentally ill. Between 1938 and 1941, the Nazis perfected their gassing techniques on 70,000 mentally ill Germans. German scientists eventually came up with a form of cyanide that became a gas when it was exposed to air. The commercial name was called Zyklon B. Now, at first, or Zyklon B, and this took, from the point of contact with Zyklon B to the point of death was somewhere in the area of 15 to 20 minutes. Now, at first, as reports of this began to filter out of Eastern Europe, Allied leaders and Jewish leaders were absolutely incredulous at these reports of genocide. But even when the reports were confirmed in the West, no effort was made to bomb the camps or to bomb the railroad lines that led to the camps. There were moments of heroism in this all. I think this is what you write about, right? There were large-scale resistance movements in Denmark, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, in Italy, where non-Jewish persons rallied to protect the Jews in their midst. But nonetheless, there was an awful lot of people who either gleefully abetted the Nazis or did nothing to stop them. Pope Pius XII, who was Pope Pius XI's successor, never directly condemned Nazi persecution of the Jews, even when Jews in Rome were herded into cattle cars and sent to concentration camps. There was scant sympathy for Jews among the Roman Catholic clergy in Poland, which was bitterly anti-Semitic. And I think this is important because what it means is that efforts to blame this all on a few deranged Nazis are really indefensible. There were tens of thousands of people who were directly complicit in the Holocaust, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who were indirectly complicit in it all. And then, of course, millions of people who knew what was happening but did nothing to stop it. And few of these people were ever held accountable for their crimes. Okay, I have 15 minutes left, and I want to conclude with some thoughts on how historians have made sense of this all. And once again, I approach this as an outsider with the certainty that Myrna knows much more about these debates than I do. But for several decades following the Holocaust, historiographical debate on the Holocaust essentially centered on two broad schools of thought. Okay, there is the intentionalist view of the Holocaust and the functionalist view of the Holocaust. So what does this all mean? Well, the intentionalists see the Holocaust as the product of Nazi willfulness. Okay, so the roots of the Holocaust could be found in the Nazi Party. Intentionalists tend to emphasize works like Hitler's Mein Kampf, the Nuremberg Laws. So the Nazis had a plan and they acted on it. Okay? The functionalists argue that there was no master plan to eradicate the Jews, although they recognize the deep anti-Semitism of Nazi leaders. The functionalists tend to see the Holocaust as the product of a specific confluence of events that all came to a head at Wannsee in 1942. And functionalists tend to emphasize rivalries within the bureaucracy rather than the ambitions of political leaders. Has anybody ever read Eichmann in Jerusalem? Well, Adolf Eichmann was a plain bureaucrat that was tried in Jerusalem in '61 for abetting the Holocaust. But I think his case is emblematic of the functionalist view of the Holocaust. This man was good at nothing but following orders, and he wanted to follow them as best as he could. Yeah?
Are we only going to be talking about the intentionalist and functionalist? Because I find it very interesting because one says there's a master plan, and you can read about this in Mein Kampf and like blah blah blah. And the other one says, oh well, this wasn't. There was no real intentionality in destroying the Jewish race. It was just something that happened along the way. Is that what you're saying? It just happened during the course of events?
Well, let me ask you that question. Is that one of the critiques of the functional school, that it tends to deny moral responsibility for the Holocaust? Is that, no?
I don't get that. Can you maybe elaborate?
It was more a function of that anti-Semitism and the confluence of ambition, bureaucratic ambition, and the fact that World War II brought into the Nazi sphere millions of Jews who had to be taken care of. It was a function of how the bureaucracy, these ambitious people, needed to work to please their superiors.
Yeah.
Because of Jewish men, Jewish businessmen, Jewish bankers, Jewish banks.
Well, I think the interpretation that I have given you today is essentially a functional interpretation of the Holocaust, which is I have cited three deep-seated factors that I think facilitated the Holocaust, that set the stage for it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Hitler's intentions weren't important, but I think what it means is that Hitler's intentions alone weren't enough. And, you know, the soil had been tilled, so to speak, for this event to take place. You know, some of you know who read the newspaper, the Holocaust deniers are in the news again because the most prominent of them, David Irving, was sentenced to 3 years in prison in Austria. Although I see that he has now renounced his beliefs. And the functionalists are not deniers. I mean, they are not denying that this event occurred. They are just questioning, how central were the top political leaders in the Holocaust.
I think to understand it, these were the two theories that were used to try and explain this, but a more mature interpretation has sprung up, which talks about the confluence of both of those factors.
And I think that's where Yehuda Bauer has situated himself, right? Yeah, you always want to be in the middle. Yeah, and even the other Holocaust historian that I've read, Christopher Browning, I think, has also moved from the functionalist interpretation to some sort of synthesis. But also, the interests of historians have changed. And particularly the past 10 years, there's been a great deal of interest in getting down to the level of ordinary persons who participated in murder and what were their motivations. And we have two very good books about this right now. Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men and Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners. And when you get to the level of an individual, the situation becomes much more nuanced or complex. But let me conclude with my favorite sociologist's view of the Holocaust, Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman places the Holocaust within broader trajectories of modernization. And I know some of you who've had me for class before will have heard me talk about this. Bauman thinks that one of the characteristics of modern states, whether they be Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, democratic America, whatever, is that they are gardening states. Okay? And what Bauman means by gardening states is that modern states try to take care of their populations. Okay? They see to the welfare of their populations. Now, how is it here in the United States that the American government sees to the welfare of its citizens? Yeah.
Partly through the welfare program, that citizens who can't construct standard of
That's right. I mean, there are countless ways. If you think of the American public as a garden, right, and the American government is the gardener, there are countless ways that the American government tends to that garden, right? I mean, the income tax is redistributed. It takes money from rich people and gives it to poor people. Well, not as much now as before, but nonetheless, various social programs. The GI Bill, if you serve in the Army, we will pay for your education. These are all examples of what Bauman calls the gardening state. But that said, what's so interesting about Bauman's analysis is he sees Nazi Germany as being a perverse outcome of the gardening state. Right? In Nazi Germany, Jews were the weeds that had to be pulled out of the garden of the citizenry. And I think one reason why this is so provocative is it suggests that the line dividing us from a genocidal regime is actually pretty thin. Now, another reason why this is interesting is if you put this on, if you could plot out modernization. And so here's our graph. And we'll put level of modernity. And then time. Okay, so this is Germany. This is our graph. We always thought of the Holocaust as being an aberration in the sort of, the story of progress, right? So here we have Nazi Germany. We get up to 1933, Hitler comes to power, and then Germany drops down like this, and then at the end of the war, they go up like this. The story of German progress. And we map this out to calculate the level of modernity. But what Bauman suggests is that the Holocaust was a thoroughly modern phenomenon. Okay, it was not an aberration from modernity. The Holocaust was underpinned by this notion, this modern notion that states are gardening states. Modern states are gardening states. It was underpinned by modern doctrines like nationalism. So much of the rationale for the extermination of the Jews was based on pseudo-scientific theories of race and of hygiene. So it cloaked itself in modern garb. And then, of course, technology made the killing possible. So the Holocaust was not at all an aberration in the trajectories of modernization. It was rather a perverse outcome of modernization. Now that's very confusing. Anybody have any questions on this? Any questions on anything I've said up here today? None at all? I've lulled you all to sleep? Yeah.
It's not specifically for these days, but it's kind of something that we've been reading about in our Irving book, is that she makes a distinction and says, when Germans invaded Poland, we wanted Polish people to be German slaves. They wanted to be slaves. And then when they went into the Soviet Union, they wanted like complete freedom. And that's why there were like 27 million Soviets that were killed. And I was just curious about that, like why were Polish people supposed to be slaves? Why was the Soviet Union supposed to be completely obliterated?
Well, I mean, I think much of it is probably a confluence of a couple different factors. First of all, the Soviet Union was communist, and you know that Hitler was an arch anti-communist. Many of the persons who were killed by the Einsatzgruppen were communists. You know, when the Nazis would march into a village, they would round up the local, party leadership and promptly execute them. What you've asked essentially speaks to a broader issue, and students in my class I disabuse of promptly. That is, World War II was fundamentally a war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The role that we played in it, the role that Britain played in it, was really only peripheral. That was the crux of the war was in the East.
Didn't it also have to do with the large ethnic German populations?
Yeah, although the Germans were deported at the outset of the war, there's two large German populations in the Soviet Union. In the Baltic provinces, which of course were annexed according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there were many ethnic Germans, and then there was an even larger population along the Volga River. And when the war began, the Volga Germans were deported to Central Asia, where they still live, actually. You can travel through Central Asia and come across these wonderful little German villages. But I don't know if that was a rationale for the sort of vitriolic hatred. Anything else? Okay, well, that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.